Salisbury Cathedral, where I'm the Canon Chancellor, and it's the 5th of July. Welcome again to my study. I'm Edward Probert. Yesterday afternoon I had a startling experience. I was at Evensong. That's not the startling bit. But as I was not taking the service, I was lingering around and drifted out with the last vestiges of the congregation and found myself close to a family with 3 young children. And overhearing their accents, I asked them where they came from when we were outside the building. And they came from Atlanta, Georgia. Now, that's lovely in itself, but it was startling because I have not heard American accents or American tourists, or indeed tourists from anywhere very much apart from the United Kingdom, for well over a year now. This was a family that had come over for a month's holiday, and they had quarantined on arrival, and they were going to quarantine on the way back, but they really wanted to come to the UK. So it was lovely to have 5 minutes of conversation with them and to know that people still want to come here after all these complicated times. So that's a lovely prospect, rather like snowdrops, daffodils, Noah's dove, the first swallows of summer, signifiers of hope of better times to come. In other news, I understand Wimbledon is on and we're in the second week and there is still a British contender. And I understand there's some football going on at the moment, and if you're English at least, things are going well. And finally, on these random pieces of news, in the middle of last week, I, along with, I guess, tens of thousands of other people, received an email from Lord's Cricket Ground in London telling me that this Saturday, that's a few days from now, the end of this week, the cricket match between England and Pakistan, for which all the tickets that had been sold were rescinded several months ago under COVID restrictions, were now back on, and therefore my tickets would be reissued to me. Now, as it happens, I had already rubbed out that event from my diary, and I was very, very lucky that I had not found something else to do on Saturday. And my wife and I are now able to go. But we had 10 days warning there. Now, I'm delighted about these things. These are all very positive. But as I look at look forward to being amongst 30,000 people at Lord's on Saturday, as I look at the scenes at football grounds with tens of thousands, many more, in fact, around Europe, and when I contrast those with the complexities through which I and a couple went to get them married 2 days ago on Saturday, this does leave a rather difficult taste in the mouth, to be honest with you. This couple should have been married back in April, and it was, of course, not possible to be married then, so it was deferred to now. 24th of, where were we? It was 3rd of July, should have been beyond the release of lockdown measures, but in fact was not. So it was still complicated organising their wedding, and right up until the last minute, to the very finest point, we were still trying to work out together, not just them, but their families and friends and wedding organisers and our head verger and others, trying to work out exactly how we could make their now quite modest scale wedding work in the space of this huge cathedral here. It really was a major challenge which took us right to the wire. Fortunately, all went well. It was a lovely occasion. But the difficulty of getting 60 or 70 people into a wedding service, all wearing masks, all keeping socially distant as appropriate, whilst meanwhile 60,000 people are watching a football match when they've come from all around the country and probably indeed all around the continent, is a pretty strange contrast. There were also some relatively farcical elements, of course, in the wedding. Nothing to do with the couple, nothing really to do with the cathedral. But if you've observed or been at any of our services in recent weeks, you'll have noticed that when the choir is singing, not only are the congregation not in any way allowed to join in the singing, that's one strand of these complications, but the other is that we are now under injunction to sit down when anyone is singing. So on Saturday there were 4 singers singing together. They were at the far end of the choir from where we all were sitting, but we had all to sit down every time a musical item was sung. Not entirely straightforward, a little bit farcical, as I say, because we had to migrate the couple and I, for example, from where we were in front of the altar over to some seats at the side before coming back when that was all done. We couldn't sign the registers while an anthem was being sung because that would have involved our standing up. You get the idea. It's all a bit weird, some of this stuff. Well, and you will imagine too that come the rehearsal which we had on Friday, it was I who needed that rehearsal rather more than the couple. The circumstances really were very strange for what in most respects is a fairly normal service, a wedding. Well, we as a church, and I suspect in common with pretty much all places of worship, are trying to act responsibly. We're trying to ensure that we don't endanger anyone, we don't make anyone feel anxious when they come among us. And we at the cathedral, and I think this is entirely right, have from the very beginning of this pandemic sought to act extremely responsibly and to err on the side of caution. That's impacted me and my wife personally because we happen to be skiing in Italy, in the Dolomites, just before the first intimations of COVID spread beyond China came. And we returned to England at the very end of February last year. And on the very day, I think, that we returned, there came word of there being an outbreak in Italy. And so the next morning, before I started work, we rang up the government's NHS hotline to see whether the part of Italy where we had been was in any way affected, and were told by the NHS, no, you're perfectly in the clear, you can continue to behave normally. However, we took the decision that we would isolate for 2 weeks following from then, just so that there was no question that the cathedral was acting irresponsibly in the face of this big risk. I'm glad we did that. It didn't prove to be necessary, but in fact, had we not done it, I think it would have been difficult to live with ourselves had there been something of an outbreak around the cathedral. You get the idea. We seek to behave very responsibly. But I must point out that I do not think the government's behaviour of late has been very helpful. It's issued plenty of instructions over these last many months. But then you'll have noticed of late there have been briefings to the media of tasty morsels about with suggestions that this won't go on for much longer, that we can put it all to one side very soon, that much of this doesn't apply. And that complicated the organising of our wedding, because some of that had happened before we were trying to get to the finer points of it. we're getting mixed messages, and if organisations such as ours are offered measures of discretion but then still required to apply things like social distancing, and if meanwhile big crowds are allowed at sporting events when complete strangers are gathered together, whilst smaller groups, very small groups really, of people at an event like a wedding or a funeral are brought together, many of whom already know one another, this is not a very helpful conjunction. It is the kind of mixed messaging which confuses people and frustrates people too. Most recently, the Prime Minister has talked about the need for people to take personal responsibility. Well, amen to that. Always amen to that. But I'm afraid that's not the get out of jail free card, which it would appear that quite a lot of this administration imagines it to be. A government is the corporate entity of this country. We've given it certain proper powers on our behalf. They have their own collective rights and their own collective responsibilities. 65 million of us are not in a position to make policy about a pandemic. We don't have the information, we don't have the expertise, we don't have the powers to address those challenges. Leaving it like that does not leave us in a position of responsibility, it leaves us in a position of anarchy. And of course, left like that, no one is ultimately accountable for what happens. It would, in my view, be very helpful and properly responsible if the government ceased that drip of unaccountable, ultimately unaccountable briefing, even if the named minister or prime minister is attached to it. And if it then enabled us as a society to move with a clear, common purpose through this very complex situation, one which confronts us all, even though it confronts us in our own small corners. It's not just emotions like frustration and so on which are at play here, it's also livelihoods and it's lives. And these are at play right around the country. The only body that can properly help us through all of this, and which must get a grip on doing so, because it is empowered to, is our government, and it must act clearly and unambiguously and accountably on our behalf. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.